Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us online today. My name is Lucy Letterhandler. I'm the curator at the Art Gallery of Southwestern Manitoba, where we are currently the happy hosts of the exhibition Prairie Interlace, Weaving Modernisms and the Expanded Frame, 1960 to 2000. This exhibition looks at textile from the Canadian prairies, but we all know that the prairies are vast and for time immemorial have been a landscape of motion and migration and exchange, unconcerned with political boundaries. So let's start off today by picturing the prairies as that expanse. I am joining you today from Treaty 2 territory, and my guests are calling from the Treaties 4 and 6, and we are all of us temporary residents of the lands of the Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and of course, the Métis Nation. We invite and encourage questions from you, which you can share with us via the comment section below the video. After their presentation, I'll come back and pose those questions to our speakers. And I also want to encourage you all to check out their website at prairieinterlace.ca for way more detail and information than we could ever fit into a panel. So now let's meet them. First, I'll bring up Timothy Long, who is, Welcome, Timothy. Timothy Long is a graduate of the Art History program at the University of Regina and the Graduate Art History and Criticism program at the State University of New York, where at Stony Brook. Sorry, I lost my screen there for a second. He was appointed the head curator at the Mackenzie Art Gallery in 2001, where he has worked for the last 28 years. Over that time, he has developed expertise in curating and coordinating large, nationally touring exhibitions of contemporary and historical Canadian art. In 2005, he curated Regina Clay, Worlds in the Making, a touring and online exhibition for the Virtual Museum of Canada that examined innovative clay practices which emerged from Regina in the 1960s and 70s, including the work of Victor Sikansky. Most recently, he co-curated the touring retrospective of David Thauberger, titled Road Trips and Other Divisions, which was a co-production with the Mendel Art Gallery, Remain Modern, as well as curating the exhibition Wilf Perot in the Alley and Tactile Desires, the work of Jack Suras, co-curated, I believe, by Julia Krueger, which was a co-production with the Tom Thompson Art Gallery. He also coordinated the nationally touring retrospective of Saskatchewan artist Joe Fafard, a co-produced project with the Mackenzie Art Gallery and the National Gallery of Canada. Welcome, Timothy. And we have here Julia Krueger, who studied art history and Canadian art history at Carleton University in Ottawa and ceramics at the Alberta College of Art and Design, ACAD, now AU Arts, in Calgary. In 2020, she completed a PhD in visual culture at the University of Western Ontario in London and is currently the permanent collection registrar with SaskArts. In addition to her studies, Julia has maintained an active teaching, writing, curatorial, and research practice grounded in material culture and craft theory with a focus on Canadian prairie craft. She has taught art history courses at the University of Western Ontario, Luther College, University of Regina, and ACAD. Her writing has been included in Cahiers Métiers d'Art, Craft Journal, Crafting New Traditions, Canadian Innovators and Influence, the Encyclopedia of Saskatchewan, and Studio Magazine. She has curated or conducted research for exhibitions such as Hanson Ross Pottery, Pioneering Fine Craft on the Canadian Prairies, Keepsakes of Conflict, Trench Art and Other Canadian War-Related Craft, Tactile Desires, the work of Zach Surs, and Victor Sikansky, The Gardener's Universe. Finally, Michele Hardy studied textiles and craft at Sheridan College School of Crafts and Design and Nova Scotia College of Art and Design and the University of Alberta before turning to cultural anthropology at the University of British Columbia for her PhD. Joining Nickle Galleries at the University of Calgary in 2005, she has curated more than 36 exhibitions with a particular emphasis on Alberta craft and textiles. Highlights include Sandra Sawatzky, The Age of Uncertainty in 2022, Shona Rae, Reimagined Narratives in 2018, Laura Vickerson, The Between in 2016, and John Chalke, Surface Tension in 2015. Hardy is an Adjunct Associate Professor in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Calgary, and she regularly teaches courses related to art and museum studies. Hardy regularly offers conference presentations and guest lectures, and is the author of numerous books and chapters, articles, and exhibition catalogues. Recent publications include Embroidering Development, the Mutwa and Rann Utsav in Kutch, India, and Radical Access, Textiles and Museums, which was co-authored with Joanne Schmidt. So welcome, everybody. You're certainly not doing anything to assuage the stereotype of the long academic title, right? But I'm going to just get the ball rolling because I invited you here after hearing each of you share in a panel where you each got 3 to 5 minutes, and it left me wanting a lot more. So we're going to give you time, and I want to make sure that you have as much as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up this and invite Timothy to take it away. Oh, you're muted. There you go.
Thank you, Lucy. It's a great pleasure to join you today to talk about Prairie Interlace. For the curators, Michele, Julia, and me, this has been a real labor of love and one that has deepened our appreciation of prairie textiles and the incredibly talented and diverse group of artists who created them. Can we have our first slide, please? As a joint project of the Nickle Galleries in Calgary and the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Regina, we are so pleased to see it tour to the AGSM as the third stop on its tour of Western Canada. But how did this project begin? That's where we'll start our discussion today. Next slide. For me, it goes back 10 years to a call I received from Stephen Smart, an art consultant in Toronto. The call was regarding Saskatoon artist Kaya Sinelma Harris and her monumental tapestry, Sun Ascending, one of the largest tapestry commissions in Canadian history, which we see here. In 1984, Cadillac Fairview initiated an invitational competition for public art for the new Toronto Dominion Centre. For the interiors of the buildings, which were designed by the legendary Mies van der Rohe, the decision was made to acquire textiles in order to warm the austere modernist interiors. Next slide. 2 outdoor sculpture commissions were also awarded at the same time, including the work of another prairie artist, Joe Fafard, whose bronze cows have become a Toronto landmark. Next slide. But unlike Fafard's sculptures, Harris's monumental tapestry was being deinstalled to make room for new commissions. Here we see it in the north lobby of the Toronto Dominion Bank Tower, where it was hung on the main floor elevator banks in 2 sections of 12 panels, each 13 feet high by 38 feet wide. My visit to the bank convinced me of the beauty and importance of this work, which gently evokes the welcoming space of a prairie poplar bluff. I was able to secure it as a donation for the Mackenzie, but within the collection, it continued to nag at the edges of my thought. And that eventually led to this exhibition. Next slide. Talking with Julia Krueger initially and later with Michele Hardy, we realized there were significant underrepresented histories connected with this and other prairie textile artists that begged to be investigated. What led to the post-war rise of weaving as a major art form on the prairies? Who were these artists and what networks sustained their production? How was the evolution of interlace practices shaped by interactions with narratives of craft, feminism, indigeneity, regionalism, and architectural design? In the words of craft historian Tanya Herod, we saw the need to recover lost modernisms, connected with craft processes and objects that were largely made by women, newcomers, and Indigenous artists. Next slide. While the need for the exhibition was clear to us, the shape it should take was not. The first problem was one of definition. We were interested in weaving, to be sure, but what about other textile practices? Pondering this question led us to our first critical decision, which was to widen the focus from weaving to include knitting, rug hooking, and macrame, all interlace practices which seem to have a natural affinity in that they each employ yarn and thread as a structural element. And here we see a detail of Jane Sartorelli's Caridwin, a freeform macrame piece. Other textile arts that are needle-based, such as quilt making and embroidery, and those employing felting, while produced by artists who often shared many of the same concerns, grew out of different material lineages. And importantly, they were not affected by the historical currents which interested us, such as the early Searle weaving classes, which set the groundwork for developments on the prairies, or the Lausanne International Tapestry Biennials, which provided an international stimulus to many of the prairie artists. Next slide. The second critical decision was to focus on works produced primarily as artworks, as opposed to yardage, clothing, and other practical items. This was not intended as a value judgment, but rather as an acknowledgement of what was new during this period, as weavers and other interlace artists saw their work enter the arena of contemporary art. Prairie weavers and other textile-based artists, like their ceramist counterparts, were determined to challenge traditional definitions of craft and engage with painting, sculpture, and photography. Internationally, interest in experimental approaches to fiber art reached its high water mark at this moment, led by the influential Lausanne International Tapestry Biennials, which ran from 1961 through to 1995. Next slide. Winnipeg's Charlotte Lindgren, whose work we see here, was among the Canadian contingent which made decisive contributions to the Lausanne Biennials, and also at events such as Expo 67, where this work, Winter Tree, was featured. New ideas were then brought home and disseminated by prairie artists who had traveled on the international stage, as well as through the steady stream of international luminaries who led workshops at the Banff Centre, an international fiber hub. Like artists, craftspeople, and architects throughout Europe and North America and elsewhere, prairie artists were drawn to the warmth, the materiality, and the sheer experimental potential of innovative weaving practices. Next slide. And yet, even with these decisions to narrow our focus, the field of production seemed dauntingly large. Beginning in the 1960s, it seemed that every kitchen and bedroom there was somebody setting up a loom or trying their hand at macrame and rug hooking. Across the region, there were hubs of teaching emerging, such as at the Alberta College of Arts, the Banff Centre, or here in Saskatchewan at the Saskatchewan School for the Arts in Fort Capel. And here we see one of the SSA participants knitting with oversized needles during a wearable art workshop led by Evelyn Roth in 1972, a real slice of the 1970s. Next slide. Also crucial to developments on the prairies were the numerous local guilds and clubs, where skills were honed and modernist ideas were tested and translated. Here we see Prairie Barnacles, a collaborative work created to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Crafts Guild of Manitoba. In the end, we included 60 works by 48 artists, drawing on public and private collections from across Canada. But we could easily have done 3 or 4 exhibitions with the works we found. What you see in Prairie Interlace is just the tip of the iceberg and is by no means a complete representation of the activity of the period. We did, however, identify some recurrent themes that we found useful in organizing the exhibition. Next slide. In the Soft Power is the title that we gave to the section featuring the many works which were produced for architectural settings. The construction resulting from the oil boom of the 1960s and 70s provided numerous opportunities for weavers and other textile artists to produce monumental works. We've already seen the commission that Kaya Snelma Harris received for the Toronto Dominion Centre. Marge Uzichipi's tapestry Tahashina, the large hooked rug, which we see at the left on the back wall in this photo, is another important example. Next slide. This work was produced with the Sioux Handicraft Collective of the Standing Buffalo First Nation in Saskatchewan for the University of Regina Library, a graceful modernist building designed by Minoru Yamasaki, who is perhaps better known as the architect of the World Trade Center in New York. These works were too large in some cases to include on the tour, but smaller works by Kaya and the Sioux Handcraft Collective have been included to give a sense of their production. Next slide. In the section Body Politics, we considered the significant role played by textile artists in the many cultural debates of the post-war period. A great example of this is a work produced by Phyllis Green for the 1975 Winnipeg Art Gallery exhibition, Woman as Viewer, a show marking International Women's Year. The show was put together hastily after the WAG's initial show, Images of Women, was found not to have any works actually produced by a woman. Boob Tree was an immediate hit and was featured on the catalog cover and poster, which, by the way, disappeared as soon as they were put up. And it's been some job trying to track down an existing copy. Artists like Green, can we go to the next slide, please? Artists like Green openly embraced fiber's relationship to craft while also challenging the hierarchical and gender-based art-craft divide, which in turn expanded the domestic frame and critical discourses around gender. Next slide. For Indigenous artists, rug hooking and weaving straddled marketing imperatives, calls to preserve traditional knowledge, and fresh creative impulses, a model of cultural adaptation and survivance, such as we see here in Métis artist Margaret Harrison's Margaret's Rug, a memory map of her home in the Qu'Appelle Valley. Next slide. One of the surprises was the discovery of Cree artist Anne Ratt, who employed traditional looping techniques to create rugs out of rabbit skins in northern Saskatchewan, a work which really did expand the frame of our investigation. Next slide. In the section Elemental Landscapes, we looked at how artists pursued the expressive ideals of modernist abstraction, exploiting weaving's tactility to provide works whose impact could be felt, both literally and figuratively. Prairie artists, including several first-generation immigrants with ties to European and American weaving traditions, wove elemental responses to the prairies, such as Brandon's own Elaine Rounds, which we see here. Next slide. Other Western landscapes are represented in Catherine Dickerson's West Coast Tree Stump. And next slide. In Brenda Campbell's majestic tapestry, Woodlands Undercover. In some cases, use of natural materials, such as locally sourced wool or dyes from native plants, introduced the land directly into the weaving. Next slide. Finally, in the section Working on and Off the Grid, we explore the harmonic resonance between the modernist grid of 20th century art, the survey grid of the prairies, and the ordered grid of the loom, elements brought together with sublime results in Pat Adams' landscape weavings. For other artists, a questioning of the conventions of craft and art led to experiments with off-loom practices that move into 3 dimensions. Next slide. Unconventional materials, such as spun dog hair, were used by Winnipeg artist Susan Barton Tate in a free-form woven work named after her dog, Nepenthe, who donated his hair to this project. Next slide. Prince Albert artist Nancy Kreitz used blue and pink condoms to create her hooked welcome mat, a work commenting on the AIDS crisis of the 1990s. Next slide. And who could forget Winnipeg's Aganitha Dick, who expanded the technical and conceptual language of weaving through her use of machine-shrunken woolen sweaters. Next slide. We realized that the exhibition itself was not enough. Supported by a major grant from Canadian Heritage, we were able to develop a website that extends access to this amazing history. Next slide. We were particularly happy to include on the site interviews with a number of the artists conducted by writers, these interviews allowed the creators to provide a testimony in their own words to this vibrant period. The book that we're producing with the University of Calgary Press will feature the work of a range of writers, including Alison Calder, who you see here. And their work writing captures the rich histories of the period, as well as addressing theoretical issues connected with the work. This book is slated to launch in conjunction with the final presentation of the exhibition at the Mackenzie Art Gallery here in Regina, opening this November. Next slide. To conclude, I wanted to share my impression of this exhibition, which I had when I first saw it at the Nickle Galleries. Of course, we curated the show during COVID, so I hadn't seen many of the works in person until I was actually at the Nickle. And at that time, I remember being struck by the astonishing freedom of these works. Weaving doesn't need a frame, unlike painting and photography, nor does it need a plinth, unlike sculpture. Instead, it has a structural integrity in which the interlace of threads and yarn hold a kind of, I would almost say, a presence that is animated by nothing less than the binding power of our social fabric. This is something that I've explored further in the essay for the catalog. But I just wanted to say that that presence is located in its power to touch, a power which weaving and other interlace practices exert, as these artists found, at the expense of being dismissed by the touchless discourses of painting, sculpture, and photography. The removal of Harris's Tapestry Commission from the TD Centre brought this point home, and it set us on a curatorial trajectory that led to many discoveries and challenges, as Julia will now describe.
Thank you so much, Timothy. I'll remind everybody that if you do have questions, you can pose them to our speakers in the comments section of wherever you're joining us from. And as Timothy says, we would like to invite Julia. Thanks, Timothy.
Thank you, Timothy and Lucy. At the onset of the research phase for Prairie Interlace, as Timothy mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Now, what would normally happen with a project like this is that the curators or a contracted researcher would travel to archives and collections to personally view as many pieces as they can before making any decisions about what would be in the show. For me, the hunt to find the collections to visit and then finally going behind the scenes to see the pieces in person is one of my favorite parts of historical and retrospective projects like Prairie Interlace. However, with travel restrictions and closures during the pandemic, viewing the works in person was impossible. Instead, we had to comb through online databases or rely on staff who were allowed to enter lockdown facilities to be our eyes. Over and over again, we were faced with examples like these from the SaskArts Permanent Collection database. Sometimes there would be no image and weird data like measurements listing a running time of 162 minutes. What does that even mean for Junko by Caius and Elma Harris? Or sometimes we would come across a black and white image, which doesn't help much, especially when you think about the colorful atoms example you just saw with Timothy. This is where we had to rely on staff to be our eyes, as they could enter the vaults when we couldn't, to snap photos similar to this one. Now we see the color. Can you smell the prairie mid-morning air when looking at this piece like I can? I just want to take a moment to express how grateful we all are to all the collection staff who went above and beyond during the pandemic to snap photos for us and even digitize artist files. Also, I want to point out that I am purposefully opening with Saskart's examples because I am the registrar for this collection, meaning it's my job to ensure that there are images for researchers and that the information in the database is correct. Guess I'm going to have to look into that 162-minute running time issue. As I move forward in this presentation, the comments I make are not meant to call out any particular collection or the people working there, as I am acutely aware that record keeping and collections care is a never-ending behind-the-scenes job, and that everyone is doing the best they can with the resources they have. Instead, the critical observations being made here today are meant to get curators and researchers thinking about some of the challenges faced when curating and researching textiles that might cause them to abandon a textile-related project. While Junko and 10 a.m. were not selected for the exhibition, this is an example of a work that was. On the left was the only research image available for us to work with, and on the right is the actual Mariette Rousseau Vermette weaving in the show. We knew the piece wasn't this greeny color, but couldn't confirm its actual color until Michele was able to view the piece in person when restrictions were relaxed. Now, as inconvenient as they were, the pandemic restrictions shone a spotlight on the challenges of storing, documenting, studying, and exhibiting textiles, challenges that we have come to believe stifle and suppress textile research, even when there isn't a pandemic. The pandemic just amplified them. Collectively, we started to refer to these challenges as the troubles with textiles. I'm going to quickly go over some of them, and it's important to note that rather than understanding these as a list, think of them as cyclical, or like a web where a trouble feeds into another, and not every textile suffers from every trouble. The first is a lexical lack. Now, I come from a craft background, and I'm going to use a craft quote for you by M. Anna Ferriello. To be talked about, understood, appreciated, and valued, craft must have its own language. The same is true for the fields within craft, such as textiles. While textiles do have their own language, it's often either not used, misused, or misunderstood by the larger art world, making it hard to search for what you don't know is in a collection. And remember, keep in mind that for Prairie Interlace, we had to rely on either the staff understanding the language we were using or the databases using the correct language so that when we searched, we could get the hits we were looking for. Let's look at an example. To purists, tapestry is, and get ready for some textile-specific language in addition to tapestry, a discontinuous weft-faced pictorial textile. Murray Gibson's Prairie carpet, which you see here, is a tapestry. Confusingly, William Parahudoff's punch-hooked untitled tapestry has tapestry in the untitled title and is also categorized as a tapestry rather than, for example, as a rug or a wall hanging, meaning that searching for all the tapestries in the Confederation Center's collection would produce a list that included Parahudoff's piece, even if we only really wanted to see quote-unquote true tapestries. In other collections, tapestry was a searchable word in the materials field, but these search results included the free-form macrame pieces of Jan Sartorelli and the pieced and knotted leather work of Ilse Ansias Salkakis, which you see here. Both are not true tapestries. However, using tapestry to describe these works isn't necessarily wrong, as the term is often used to describe pictorial, fiber-based works that are hung on a wall. However, this lexical inconsistency fosters confusion and makes it hard to articulate the parameters of a research inquiry. In some cases, the catch-all term mixed media concealed the identity of textiles altogether, and I found myself spending hours paging through databases looking at mixed media works to try to identify them as possible weavings. But again, that was contingent on there being a good photo. Think back to the Rousseau Vermette, Adams, and Harris examples I opened with. A simple task like a search for true tapestries can easily become too much trouble compared to a project where the language is more easily understood and searchable. Architectural servitude is another trouble that we identified. Historically, architectural textiles, those designed for specific spaces, have been understood to be subordinate or in service to architecture, which undermines the ability for some to appreciate them as art objects. And apart from the physical, logistical, and aesthetic challenges of creating textiles to suit and serve architectural settings, rarely the other way around, or in a sense that a building is built for a textile, I might add, their servitude does not end with their removal from architectural spaces, as they were created to fit within a certain complex dimensional space. To put it more bluntly, unlike a piece of furniture or a painting, architectural textiles can't simply be moved and reinstalled in another building or be at home in the white cube. We have already looked at two pieces that were made for specific spaces, Sun Ascending by Caius and Alma Harris and Prairie Carpet by Murray Gibson. And in both these cases, they aren't on exhibit in Brandon because they physically can't fit in the gallery space as they were made for much larger spaces. Here's another example. Take a look at Jane Kidd's Ribbonways. This complex piece is over half a pool long in length. It was made for this particular location in Calgary, and exhibiting it in another space just wouldn't be the same. Take a moment to imagine ribbonways in your local gallery space. If it were to fit, the ceiling and floor would be much closer, and the amazing reflective elevator doors would no longer be at play. I would argue that those doors, along with the stone, metal, and glass of this interior, are key to a balance within the work, meaning it dramatically changes when it's removed from this space. When Elaine Rounds designed Prairie Vistas, she carefully took into account the circular space of this optometry office in Brandon. And in fact, we can see here how the architecture made it impossible to photograph the entire piece. Therefore, the only way to experience it is to be with it. I'm also struck with how Rounds has ingeniously embedded you, the viewer, the patient, the person waiting for an appointment or for a loved one, into a calm prairie vista. Time somehow feels different when I imagine sitting in this space. How would that time be different from the otherworldly time of the waiting room? Has Rounds, through Craft's ability to work with time, somehow created an alternative, affective waiting experience? While you wait, you aren't hovering somewhere in the sky, but nestled down in the prairie with the deep, dark grass in the foreground. Another example of architectural servitude is Susan Barton Tate's opus Northern Lights, which was created for the Manual Life building in Winnipeg. It's huge. I mean, look at the size of it compared to the elevator doors on the left. Sadly, Northern Lights, like the other architectural examples we have looked at, is no longer on display. When it was decommissioned, it was rolled up and believed to have been put in a basement somewhere. When the decision is made to retire architectural textiles, the question arises what to do with them. Those tasked with dispersing larger textiles do not always think to call a collecting institution to see if there is interest in acquiring the piece. Sometimes it's because these works aren't even understood as being art and are classified as furniture, like the waiting room chairs we just saw. I mean, you don't call a museum or an art collection to ask if they want chairs or drapery, so why would you do that for something like an architectural textile that is also in servitude to the space? Compounding this difficulty, not all institutions collect or have the capacity to house large works, especially large textiles. So it's unlikely the person dispersing the work would get a yes on the first call to the first institution. Consequently, transfer of ownership can be a long, drawn-out process, and at times renovation or moving deadlines unfold at a different pace than museum time. The transfer would also involve costs and multiple people. Imagine how heavy Barton Tate's work would be. I mean, I couldn't just roll it up, carry it out to my car and drop it off at the Art Gallery of Southwestern Manitoba for donation consideration. Instead, I would probably have to hire movers, making the donation transfer of ownership a nuisance for all but the most dedicated. This means that architectural textiles are very much at risk of being lost to a landfill or deep storage, which is problematic because these are some of the most important works of a weaver's career. So without them, how do you justify a show? Another critical factor is that the longer a textile is installed, the more damage it is likely to have received from light, dust, pests, and wear. And this leads to another trouble, fear-based avoidance. And I have to say, this trouble actually impacts a lot of crafts. Over and over again, I hear how people are afraid that a ceramic or a glass piece is going to break, when in fact, you can just as easily put your elbow through a painting or crease a work on paper. And it's actually easier to do that than break a solid glass paperweight or a woven textile. Now, that's not to say textiles are invincible. The Canadian Conservation Institute's Agents of Deterioration identifies the 10 biggest threats to the preservation of historic objects. And lucky for textiles, they're vulnerable to all 10 agents. So while museum recommendations suggest, for instance, displaying textiles for only short periods of time, architectural textiles typically remain on display in service for years in conditions that might not be ideal. For example, compare the conditions in a Medicine Hat Burger King to a white cube gallery space or a museum vault. It's so interesting to think that a handmade weaving was once in a fast food restaurant, but it is naive to think that Ikokani's service has not impacted its condition, possibly making it no longer suitable for exhibition. One particularly potent agent of deterioration for textiles is light, which can dramatically fade a work. And sometimes this is a deterrent for works to make their way into a collection or into an exhibition, meaning the most important works of a textile artist's career can be in the worst condition if they were on exhibit for a long time, leaving it up to smaller works to take their place, if those smaller works were ever even collected in the first place. The only options might be those small ones. For example, we decided not to include Margriet van Walsum's Palaver in the exhibition, even though it is one of her most significant works, and it was a major commission. The fading seen on Palaver was due to its short service at the Centre of the Arts in Regina, which ultimately led to its removal from display, as there were fears the fading would continue if it were left up. The image on the left is an in-process shot before the fade, where you can even see 2 of the cartoons or drawings Van Walsum used, while the right is its current state in the Sask Arts permanent collection. Unlike the in-situ photograph of Carvonen's work in Burger King, there are no photographs of Palaver installed within the modern interior of the Centre of the Arts, which is an example of the frustrating holes found within the archive of Prairie textile history. Museums and art galleries are frequently overstretched and understaffed. It is important to note the extra work required by the sheer size and weight of many of the works in Prairie Interlace, and this brings up another trouble: demands on human resources. In both public and private collections, large tables or clear floor spaces were required to view some of the textiles. For example, a very large Sioux handicraft cooperative rug was unrolled on a plastic-covered floor at the Canada Council Art Bank. Viewing a work like this not only required space, but also several people to help fetch, tote, unroll, and re-roll the textile. There is a cost to the institution when several staff are required for a researcher to view a rolled textile, as might be expected. When budgets are tight or capacity limited, access can be restricted to the database, only which then makes it hard to research and ultimately curate a textile exhibition. I want to close with hidden away in plain sight as the final trouble today. Let's go back to Sask Arts and have a look at their permanent collection 2D and ceramic storage areas. Pretty typical. When someone wants to see something, it's relatively easy to go to the rack or shelf and see the piece. But more importantly, for those of us who are lucky enough to spend significant time in a vault, we end up through osmosis developing favorites, curiosities, or wondrous longings. Now, contrast the visibility of these 2D works to the way textiles are typically stored, in part to help mitigate those agents of deterioration, which are one of the other troubles we discussed. Here, Sask Arts textile wall on the right, you see, I don't get to see when I'm in the textile area these works in the flesh. Instead, I only get to experience them through images in the database because they're covered up with this cotton covering. But circle back to the Rousseau Vermette for a second. What if that's the only image you have? No wonder textiles are so under-exhibited. But you could unroll one of these on the wall to see what's inside, but that takes a lot more human resources and space compared to pushing some racks open to view a painting. Think back to the giant rug I just showed you. Do you see space like that here? And in Sask Arts' cases, there literally isn't the space to unroll a textile that large. So when an institution is running at capacity and a researcher asks to see a rolled textile, and if it's an architectural one, it might be huge and also require a big space that isn't available, even taking it out to snap a better image just can't happen. So they remain hidden away in plain sight. I'm showing you here another hidden away example with the city of Calgary, where in addition to the rolls, the works are shrouded under plastic. We've learned, however, that the Royal Saskatchewan Museum has done something really interesting, replacing the cotton with transparent mylar so that the objects can, at least in some part, be in the visitor's view, to be seen, to foster curiosity, and to hopefully inhabit the longings of curators and researchers as they come through the vaults. We've learned a lot during this project, and Michele will now discuss some of the things we've learned.
Thank you so much. All those photos behind the scenes, they're so precious and so enlightening. So thanks again. We'll see you in a second. I'll bring up Michele.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Timothy, Julia, and Lucy. I'm thrilled to be here today, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share the results of our research. Prairie Interlace is a 3-year Museums Assistance Program funded project, one that began for us in 2020, as my colleagues have noted, during COVID, and winds up next summer. It's definitely the biggest project that I've had the opportunity to work on, one with many, many learning curves. I won't talk about how learning to budget on the fly went. It was challenging. Even though that was personally significant, I will focus here on lessons that emerged from working with and installing the many tremendous artworks that are included in Prairie Interlace. Without a doubt, some of our most profound insights have been about the incredible richness and variety of textile art produced on the prairies between 1960 and 2000. We initiated the project with an awareness of artists with national or international reputations, but learned of many other important artists who created, taught, and inspired communities closer to home. The history of textile making the history of textile making is unique to the prairies. It's inflected by the prairie itself, by the light, the land, the people who traditionally have lived or have moved to this place. We found evidence of how fiber entwines communities, be they rural or urban or organized around guilds, schools, or universities. Prince Albert, Brandon, Banff, Edmonton were each sites of creative experimentation. This wonderful tapestry on your screen right now was created by Anne Newdigate with members from the Prince Albert Spinners and Weavers Guild and the Saskatchewan Institute of Applied Science and Technology Weaving Program. It features portraits of Marguerite Van Walsum on the left and Kate Waterhouse on the right. Both were important artists, mentors, and community builders who gifted yarn to many of the women involved in weaving this beautiful commemorative piece. Their initials surround the portraits here. It speaks to a close-knit community of weavers and spinners who lived and worked in PA for many years. We heard similar stories of communities across the prairies, as well as how artists gathered at Banff, the Qu'Appelle Valley, and more recently Olds in Alberta to learn and share and hone their craft. We learned how fiber is ephemeral. Not only is it susceptible to bugs, light, water, wear and tear, etc., but to changing tastes and economies. The opportunities for artists, especially prairie textile artists, to create monumental commissions for public spaces dried up following the oil boom years of the 1980s. Textiles are susceptible to changing trends in fashion, interior design, and architecture, not to mention opportunities to create public commissions. Next slide, please. Julia and I met with Brenda Campbell, an artist who produced many large textiles for buildings across Calgary. Brenda shared photo album after photo album of glorious Raya tapestries, most of which have disappeared. The work on the left side of this image, for example, was created for Calgary's Remand Centre, current whereabouts unknown. Campbell was not the only artist whose works have moved and whose skill is ill-remembered today. Douglas Motter, whose work I'll share with you in a moment, was a significant weaver, designer, business owner in Calgary. The image on the right shows a youthful Brenda working on a Raya textile while she was employed at the Motter studio. Not only was Motter an important teacher and mentor, but he also created small and large works, including a major installation for the Alberta Legislature and one for the library here at the University of Calgary. Alas, both missing. I can't help but wonder if the internationally renowned, next slide, if the internationally renowned artist Mariette Vermette Rousseau could have created all that she did in the conditions that we find ourselves in today. We also learned how fiber comes and goes in lives. Next slide. That potters and sculptors experimented with fiber, that weavers paint and draw, that painters occasionally design for tapestry, that artists shift media or take up entirely new careers or mediums. On the screen is Newdigate's painting and woven tapestry. Then there was Mrs. Rorschach's dream, You Are What You See, 1988. The painting was in the collection of Sask Arts, the tapestry in the collection of the Canada Council Art Bank, miraculously reunited here. Newdigate developed her very special approach to tapestry in order to better capture the sinuous lines, immediacy, and color blending of painting. We learned how new skills could express traditional designs. Next slide. Thank you. That new skills could express traditional designs for new generations and for new markets. This dramatic grouping of mainly latched hooked rugs was made by members of the Sioux Handicraft Cooperative, who only produced for about 5 years before the project unraveled and the makers shifted to other, more sustainable textile arts. Others shifted practices because they found weaving too hard on their bodies. Weaving is physical, hard work. We also learned how old world techniques were introduced to the prairies, next slide, through many immigrants along with new ways of looking at the prairies. Pirkko Karvonen, Kaya Sinelma Harris, Ilse Anya Selkakis, Eva Heller, and Elaine Rounds were just some of the many immigrants to the prairies who developed deep ties and a love for this place. And we learned how the buoyancy of modernist textile experiments shifted through the period. Modernism represented a break from traditional art making, embracing new ideas, technologies, and experimentation with form, materials, and technique. Next one. Douglas Moder's This Bright Land, for example, experiments with angular planes of hand-woven cloth and sheets of hammered copper, their arrangements suggesting an abstracted landscape. Next one. Hazel Schwass's work Untitled, also of 1974, experiments with different materials and free-form weaving, leaving areas of warp threads exposed. Hazel had learned to weave through the Searle Grain Company's program, learning to weave according to traditional ideas of what weaving should be. By at least 1974, she was creating experimental works that broke with many of the established prescriptions of weaving. Postmodernism arrived in fits and starts, some would say beginning at about 1970 and breaking with modernism and embracing complexity, diversity, and the idea, occasionally at the expense of form and technique. Next one. Works like Mary Scott's 1988 Imago, translatable is that which denies, for example, deconstructs a length of blue tie silk, suggesting a necessary unweaving and exposure of patriarchal structures. Skill in this context is less about technical expertise, more about conceptual rigor. This shift was further evident at the Banff Centre, where the once vibrant textile-specific programs were eclipsed by interdisciplinary ones. Craft skill and medium-specific knowledge were seen as less important than other considerations, making me wonder if postmodernism is or was the frenemy of craft. Something I think, FYI, is changing. Colleagues at the Alberta University of Art, for example, have described how their students are once again demanding technique. We learned that textiles remain disadvantaged by an art world system that tends to dismiss them as domestic, feminine, trivial, and lesser than other forms of expression. As Julia's just discussed, there were many issues that tended to keep textiles in storage more than on view. Curatorial and technical staff are often ill-equipped, not just to hang exhibitions of textiles, but to exploit their unique potential. Textiles are a medium unlike others. In spite of museums' best efforts, they beg to be touched. They connect us with each other across time and space, as well as with the land and non-human beings. They embrace us, warm us, soothe us, heal us, and embellish us. The body is always potentially present in textiles, whether made up into garments, quilts, tapestries, or not. Donna Haraway might suggest that textiles offer a means for living in a multi-species symbiosis, a making with on a damaged planet. What Julia has termed metatextiles are textiles about textiles. Perhaps the clearest example of a metatextile, next one please, is Agatha Dick's work, Close Knit, which we've already seen, consisting of 65 shrunken wool sweaters arranged in line on the floor. Close Knit plays on the sweater structure, on family ties and migration. It's a work that connects us with generations of knitters, families, and farms, making do, keeping warm, keeping safe. Using textile-specific installation strategies, another Juliaism, thank you, we endeavored to foster those connections and provoke visceral experiences. No, we couldn't allow touch, but we were mindful to present works in relation to viewing, sensing bodies. We hung works more or less at eye height. We avoided the use of covered cases, frames, and other barriers that tend to impede viewing and prevent close-up study. As much as possible, we treated the works more like sculpture than framed 2D works. While many textiles were wall-mounted, we used brackets to increase the space around them, highlighting their thickness. Next slide, please. Highlighting their thickness and dimensionality. Lighting of art exhibitions tends to focus light sources evenly across works, avoiding shadows. However, with Prairie Interlace, at least at Nickle Galleries, lighting was used to emphasize not flatness, but their rich textual surfaces. Where shadows were allowed to happen, they highlighted areas of open weave, loose structure, and fringes, enhancing the perceived depth and drama of the artworks. With the work Winter Tree by Charlotte Lindgren, seen here, the shadow was an intentional feature of the work, even though that fact hadn't been recorded since the piece first entered the collection of the Confederation Arts Center. The shadow effectively grounds the work, enhancing the impression of a tree in winter and our embodied experience with it. Because it was so light and suspended, Winter Tree tended to gently spin in place, adding a welcome kinetic element to the exhibition, and continues to spin at the AGSM. Other suspended works couldn't necessarily spin, but would necessarily respond to air currents within the gallery. It's entirely fanciful, but to me, it's like they're breathing in place. Similarly, next slide, for Anne Ratt's 2 looped rabbit fur mats, we had to show them in plexiglass-topped cases. However, we raised the mats up slightly with a sheet of clear plexiglass. Installed thus, the mats appeared full and floating, offering viewers the chance to see their soft thickness. We learned that by respecting what textiles are, what they do, and our connections with them, we could, in part, subvert art world expectations about weaving and textiles. At least one University of Calgary colleague expressed surprise at how beautiful and exciting she found the exhibition, noting that she'd arrived thinking that a show about weaving would be really boring. And finally, we learned that textiles are not well represented in archives or collections here on the prairies or elsewhere. The curatorial research for Prairie Interlace was conducted during COVID, a situation that forced us to rely heavily on digital collections and scanned documents. Information contained in artist files, if they existed, were often extremely limited. Newspaper clippings, exhibition invitations, possibly an artist's CV or bio, selected information about the artist, but not necessarily by the artist, information about the presentation of their work, but not the why or how they work. Next slide, please. In her outstanding essay to the publication, or our forthcoming publication, Stand Back, Nothing to See, Move Along, Jennifer Salahub pokes fun at the assumption that nothing of any creative importance happens on the prairies. Prairie Interlace demonstrated that, at least in the realm of textiles, much creative, insightful, provocative work was created, even if we've forgotten it, even if few works entered public and private collections, and archival records are less than we might hope. Prairie Interlace is inherently partial and inherently selective. We hope it inspires further study, deeper investigations, and fresh insights into prairie-based textile arts and artists. Next slide, please. I'd like to conclude by thanking my colleagues Julia Krueger and Timothy Long, the artists, all the artists who contributed their work, their thoughts, their photos, and memories to the exhibition, to the lenders, especially the Alberta Foundation for the Arts and Sask Arts, the many writers and other contributors to the upcoming Prairie Interlace publication, our host venues at the Mann Art Gallery in Prince Albert, the Art Gallery of Southwestern Manitoba in Brandon, and of course at the Mackenzie Art Gallery upcoming in Regina this fall. I'd also like to shout out to all the superb technical assistance and support we've received: Doug, John, Aaron, Sid, and Kevin, not to mention my colleagues in libraries and cultural resources who supported this project in 1,000 different ways. And finally, thank you to Heritage Canada for generously supporting the project, and to all of you at home for joining us here today. Thank you.
Thank you. So as promised, now I'm going to bring everybody back. And before, again, anybody can comment from the platform that you're using, but I'm going to take the opportunity to jump the line. I'm going to start out with the really general, take advantage of your combined expertise and ask you to wax a little bit about what craft is. It seems to me that at this point, there's been so much innovation for the last, well, I guess we could say since the 60s, if this exhibition is any indication. The craft is more about the medium than the practice, but that's not exactly true. There's something about really subverting the idea of genius, maybe making something that should be useful useless, and that changes its context. So what do you think, open question to all four of you, happened with that?
Do you want me to start? I get asked this a lot because, you know, I sort of do the craft thing, I guess. And one of my go-tos is to talk about Glenn Adamson's definition, which really helped me to think beyond certain types of objects made out of certain material. So craft these days isn't pots versus paintings or clay versus paint. Instead, it's active. It's an active thing, and it's about a way of being and knowing in this world. And so the objects that crafters make are part of that, but it's a much bigger sort of encompassing idea. It often can involve process. It can involve materials. It can involve skill. It can involve time, like I alluded to, but it's very fluid. One of my favorite words right now. Very fluid, but also active. And that's the key, I think, to understanding how it's sort of developed over the past decade and a half. So I'll maybe throw it out to my colleagues to add to that or counter my start.
Yeah, I'd like respond to that, Julia, because we've had these discussions about, you know, what's going on in this weaving. and other interlace works that we included. And as I alluded to in my presentation, I realized that weaving operates with a different frame from the Western art object, which we typically associate with painting, sculpture, photography, etc. And that it goes back to having a different cut. If we look at a painting, we're looking at something that's based on an excisional cut, something that's excised or expelled from this world and then comes back to us as with a certain aesthetic presence. Weaving doesn't have that, doesn't need that. Its cut is, as I've come to understand it, is umbilical. The cut occurs when you cut the thread or the yarn. That's its separation from the world. And it establishes a completely different relationship to culture, to society. A weaving gets its existence when it's cut from a frame. When it leaves the frame of the loom. So it's got a different kind of being in the world. And I think it's important that it's one connected with touch. And I think that unites a lot of craft practices, what we call craft. They each have their own kind of material history. They exist with different kinds of relationships to the world. But what unites them is this relationship to touch, which was and has been inimical to the Western art object, which is based on excision or removal from touch. And so that's what's put them at odds with each other. But I think now that we're seeing that we need touch, and that artists of all stripes are recognizing that, bringing craft practices and traditions and techniques into what we call art, whatever that might be.
Thank you.
I don't think I have anything more to add to that. I was going to also mention the fact that craft has, even though it's being written, and scholars like Julie are actively writing that history, it has a particular history. And for me in particular, I'm interested in the relationality of craft and its connections with communities of practice. That, to be a weaver, to be a potter, to be a jeweler is not necessarily to work in isolation, but to work with colleagues and to share knowledge and resources and access to markets and all those kinds of things. So it's unique and it's special, and it's something that is so fascinating to me.
This talk in particular really made me think about the metaphor of weaving. I don't remember who mentioned it, but the holding together of a grid. It's almost like a rock, paper, scissors, where you have a grid and the weaving beats it, right? And the Schwass in particular reminds me of a collective in Montreal where I spent a significant amount of time, called the Dream Weavers, who do frame looms and then set themselves down in community events, and then one person at a time will build up weavings that then they'll displace and display around the community. And yeah, I think there is something about the holding together and then the cutting, as Timothy was saying. I want to ask another. Timothy, you opened with the question of what the relationship with post-war prairie society and its explosion of innovative weaving practices was, and then talked about the role of these works in mediating the perhaps slightly earlier explosion of brutalist architectures. So it seems kind of pendulumy, but also the infrastructure required for these explosions, for these aesthetic movements, contradict each other. It's like they try to suck things back in. Do you have any thoughts about what we mean when we say post-war impulses in that way?
I think it's important to look at some of the roots of weaving in the post-war period. If we go back to the Lausanne International Tapestry Biennial and Henri Lursa, the French the French weaver artist, they were really interested in reinvigorating the dialogue between weaving and architecture, which has a very long history in Europe. And they were seeing that these new concrete structures that were sprouting up everywhere provided a rich kind of background or opportunity for weaving. And so it was a kind of a marriage of two different languages which seemed to need each other. The brutalist architecture really needed something to warm it up and make it human and livable. And these weavers said, "Hey, look, we've got something that you can use." And architects quickly recognized that and sought out weavers to fill their spaces. And that was a trajectory that lasted a surprisingly long time. Given how fad cycle. I mean, the biennial lasted from 61 to 95 or 6. So it what's the bigger question for me is how do these things collapse? Are our buildings so livable now we don't need a weaving to make it seem more, or have we become embarrassed by things that invoke touch? That's what I wonder. Like, what is the relationship of weaving to photography, which is maybe a more interesting question. How photography comes to the ascendancy in the 90s in international art, and how it made weaving look backwards, look like it was something that was of the past. I think that's much more what's happening. And, if we look at those amazing photographs, we didn't show the Vickerson, that she created an entire West Coast forest at the entrance of the BC Law Courts in Victoria. I mean, can you imagine seeing that today? But, you're not allowed to have those kinds of wonky, idiosyncratic, crafty, chunky monkey experiences anymore when you go into a public building. They have to, it's too not cool.
Yeah.
So anyway, those are some of my thoughts about what went on.
It's also making me think of, airport carpets and, public bus seat covers and things where they've kind of, they nod to these designs, right? Yeah.
And I would just add, there's a really interesting relationship to handmade craft before brutalism. For instance, Le Corbusier in his house at the 1925 exhibition actually had handmade objects in there. And then if you ever take a look at the Eames's home, it's just decked out with craft and handmade objects and weavings and all those things. And somehow, it came together beautifully, as Timothy just said, with brutalism. And then somehow all of a sudden, this idea of a modern space was to be devoid of all that. And I think that also played into the lack of commissions that we start to see in the late 80s and early 90s, which caused a number of weavers to sort of shift to other forms of making because they just couldn't sustain their practice.
Good. Do you have anything to add, Michele? So I'm mad with power, and we're already 10 minutes over, but I do want to ask, just before we wrap up, if you have any theories about all of these missing pieces. This is why I was so excited for this, because it's as much as it's a talk about the exhibition that you can see at the AGSM until September 10th if you are in Brandon, and beginning November 4th if you're in Regina, and again also on the extensively researched website. This sister exhibit of lost items. Do you have any theories about where they are? Do you think that they're in attics? Do you think that they actually got thrown out? Do you think they're badly filed? Does anybody have any theories about this? I keep picturing attics,
My fear would be that, if things are in attics or basements, they're not going to be in very good condition.
Yeah.
The truth is out there somewhere. And, fortunately with COVID mostly behind us, it does mean that, we're able to get out into the community and meet the artists or the children of artists and begin to ask those questions.
Yeah.
You never know who's going to be at the other end of the phone. Somebody called me yesterday. So yeah. I'm optimistic.
And we've seen examples, like I had, a donor come out of the blue and with a Marguerite Van Valsum, amazing weaving, and they knew that they had something, and so I know that they're out there. I think it's like placing a value on it, and that's what I think that one of the things that we hope comes out of this show is that people start to place a value on this work, and that maybe it encourages them to consider again, if they've got a piece from this period, that maybe it's got some value to it. Maybe it's worth preserving.
Yeah.
I'm not hope. I have to say I'm worried about this period and its and the long-term survival of a lot of the work.
I especially seeing that Rousseau Vermette, I believe it was the huge kind of chandelier installation on the slideshow there. It's hard to imagine.
That was my slide. That was Roy Thompson Hall.
Yeah.
And that was a still from the just published book on her. So, clearly a publication that's long overdue.
Great. Yeah. Fabulous. I was just thinking about uninstalling it and literally throwing out. It just doesn't seem possible that anybody would not, if not as a fine art object, just something that can't be disposed of, Yeah.
Just keeping those things clean. These are hugely expensive items to maintain and to keep in good condition. So thus they get wrapped up and put in storage. In the case of the Douglas Motter piece, it literally had not been out for decades. And we had to pretty much figure out how to install it because, nobody with a memory of doing it was still around.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the West Coast tree stump had also been in a box for decades, right?
Yep.
And that's a shame. That's a magnificent beast, right? It's like it needed to wake up. Yeah.
The artist came to the opening and brought her adult daughter who had never seen the piece. Yeah. So, we had many, many special moments like that. And I expect we'll have more when the show gets to Regina, where artists were able to see these pieces, sometimes for the first time in years and years. Or in the case of the Winona Yates piece, her daughter flew in from Winnipeg and, came to visit her mom. It was really, really wonderful.
Yeah. I started at the AGSM during COVID as well. So I had two exhibitions that were really mostly closed. And I would every day go in and turn on the lights and set up, ready for the audience and walk around and look at the art. And I thought I was being kind of sentimental, it needs to be, I'm going to go visit the art, I'd say, and I'm realizing, especially after Julia's talk and looking at the transparent wraps as well, that it's not sentimental. It's these things fall out of art historical memory and memory in general if they're not truly seen, right? So the work and why I was so keen to get this exhibition is seen in person, obviously, but the work that you've done with all the research, with all of these forgotten, these lost items as well, I think is just crucial, especially as the boundaries break down and these enter into an absolutely fine arts history, right? So thank you, all three of you, for that. I can't wait for the publication to come out. And I'll release you from my prison with really great thanks. Again, a reminder to everybody that it's on here in Brandon until September 10th, and it opens Regina November 4th, going all the way through February, which is also where the publication launch will be. you can get in touch with us or Mackenzie to get updates on that publication. I can't thank you guys enough for the time. This was as fascinating as I hoped it would be. And I wish you a wonderful weekend and a great rest of your summer. I'll be in touch with you guys soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Stacey.